Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast, looking back at last weekend's thrilling Hungarian Grand Prix, but also looking forwards to this weekend's Belgian Grand Prix, the final race before the all-important summer break. From racingnews365.com, my name is Nick Golding and I'm joined as always by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Coop, and lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, will come to you first because you are fresh from the plane from Hungary. How are you? Have you managed to relax and calm down after what was quite a frenetic finish to the Hungarian Grand Prix?
No, mate, I haven't. I've literally, as we're recording this, I walked through the door 5 minutes ago of my home. So 2.5 hour drive north from Stansted Airport. So it's been a little bit fraught and frenetic, and but all good. And at least we've got a great event to talk about and look back on. It didn't look like it was going to be. Obviously, we had that little bit of a turn one skirmish, Max running wide, give the place back, of course. And then it settled down and it thought, okay, this is going to be nice, straightforward McLaren 1-2 here. And as we saw, it was anything but a nice, straightforward McLaren 1-2. So let's get stuck into it.
We will get stuck into it. And Sam, I'm going to fire over to you first as you're back fresh and rested from a holiday. Of course, you were in Spain for last week's podcast, so no pressure. This needs to be a banger now that you're back. Let's talk about Max Verstappen because obviously he gave us a thrilling Hungarian Grand Prix. McLaren gave us an amazing ending. But Max Verstappen's radio messages throughout the race came across very aggressive. Christian Horner said after the race that he wasn't happy about the way Max addressed the team, openly criticising the strategy that they gave him. And actually, there's been some very fiery words from Max that came after the race using several explicit words, which, it doesn't bode well for a driver who was in the form of his life at the start of the season. It does seem now the rails really are coming off at Red Bull. Is it fair to say now that this is perhaps a sign that once and for all, this season now, Red Bull's dominance is over?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head by picking out specifically that criticism of the strategy. I think that was the real kicker for Christian Horner. We've seen Max be similar to how he was on the radio before. Him and GP Lambiase, they spar quite often. That's not new for them. That's part of their dynamic. However, the open criticism of the team is something that Christian Horner clearly can't stomach. And that's why he has addressed it in the way he has. And he's spoken about having closed door conversations with Max. And obviously he doesn't want to get into that in the media, but no doubt there will be conversations there. So yeah, I think to kind of circle back to your overarching question, they aren't the dominant outfit anymore. I don't think there is a single dominant outfit because on their day they are still there. We saw that in qualifying. Yes, Max didn't get that final run, but he was very, very close to pole. And he will be there or thereabouts when he's on form. And he's on form 99% of the time. He very rarely has an off day. We did get one of those rare off days from him yesterday where there were a couple of uncharacteristic mistakes when he initially got past Lewis, then going wide at turn 2. That's not very much like Max. And then, he was also on the wrong side of his appraisals of different situations. Ian mentioned the lap 1 incident. It was absolutely fair cop that he had to give that position back. Then later on with the Lewis incident, call it racing incident, call it Max's fault. It certainly wasn't Lewis's fault. And that's what he initially jumped to, which was then shut down on the team radio. So it was unlike him in that sense. I think, we can talk about the 3 a.m. sim, kind of late night antics, whatever you want to call them. Whether or not that had an effect, it's very difficult to say. And I think the key thing is that he hasn't been under this level of scrutiny before, week in, week out, or at least for a while. And that's where the pressure points are coming from.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point because I think you mentioned there obviously the sim and how he's now under so much pressure. In the past, when Max has done these sim races on the same weekend as an F1 Grand Prix, more often than not, he's then gone on to win the F1 race after staying up till 2, 3 a.m. because there was no fight coming from the likes of McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari. Whereas now, obviously, he is having to work harder in the F1 races. And as we spoke about before the recording, Sam, if we were to be up until 3 a.m. and then go to work with that kind of aggressive attitude almost, we'd most likely get a slap on the wrist. Ian, do you think behind the scenes there's going to be quite some stern words coming for Max from the likes of Christian and potentially even Helmut Marko, given how openly and publicly he criticised the team, the stewards, pretty much anybody who got in his way, it seemed?
Yeah, Christian Horner, as I mentioned in our update, Nick, just turned around and said that there would be behind closed doors discussions. So that gives you some idea as to the level of seriousness with which they're taking the comments from Max. Naturally, they're not going to let anything get out in the public domain. But for Christian to openly say that they're going to have words with their number one driver, I think is a firm indicator that they are not happy with some of the comments that he was coming out with, not just over the radio during the Grand Prix, obviously post race as well. He was again criticising the team, but of course, after qualifying on Saturday, he was criticising the team, saying that some people weren't at it. He felt that there were certain areas of the team that weren't quite pulling their weight, for want of a better phrase. Just paraphrasing Max there a little bit. So I'd love to be a fly on the wall of that particular conversation because, yes, you've rightly pointed out, he's had this weekends in the past where he's gone sim racing, got in his car and won 2 races over the course of a Grand Prix weekend. I think we've even reported it ourselves on this particular website when he's done
Imola.
that.
It was an Imola.
It was Imola. So there you go. That was at a time when he was still in the ascendancy. I remember China, the Chinese Grand Prix in particular, where he described his car as being on rails and he could pretty much do anything he wanted with it and it would respond. China was the 5th race. He'd won 4 of the first 5, obviously Australia being the anomaly when he had the issue early on in that Grand Prix, but 4 out of 5, and it was a case of here we go. And yes, even though he lost to Lando in Miami, he arguably still had the better car there. And then, as we say, Imola, he had a great weekend overall. And as I say, he won the sim race and it was looking like, yeah, fabulous. Now it's not quite the case. Everything has changed. He has, we rightly pointed out, is now a driver coming under serious pressure and he's criticizing the team. He's criticizing the car. He's criticizing the strategy. You know, during the race yesterday, he criticized the brakes. He criticized the fact that the car couldn't turn in. This is a driver now all of a sudden coming under pressure, like, as Sam's just mentioned earlier, like he's not experienced for quite some time. And all of a sudden, despite the fact he still has a really healthy lead, which could be a lot less given circumstances that have taken place over the past few Grand Prix, the cracks are beginning to show. So what has he now got in his locker? We know he's a fabulous racer. We know he's a great strategist, a great tactician. Masterclass behind the wheel for the most part of what we've seen over these past 2-3 years. Now let's see what he's really got going into this second half of the season. For the most part, we've just crept into it with a 13th race of 24 in Hungary. We know he's fabulous around Spa-Francorchamps. It should be a track that's going to play really into Red Bull's hands. The question for Red Bull is this the circuit where they take the engine penalty? They know they've got one coming for Max.
Yeah.
2 years ago, Max took a full engine penalty and won from the back of the grid. He was that dominant. It's not going to happen this weekend if they do decide to take the penalty because Mercedes and McLaren most definitely would likely finish ahead of him. So it's likely going to be this is just a quick look, obviously ahead towards Spa-Francorchamps. It's likely going to be, if they do decide to take the engine penalty, there ain't another points hit for Max, as we saw in Hungary, due to the circumstances that prevailed, of course, in particular, with that late race hit with Lewis Hamilton.
And yeah, just looking ahead to, obviously, the Belgian Grand Prix, Max in particular, being the second part of this doubleheader, it's not a lot of time for Red Bull to discuss with Max what happened in Hungary and to try and sweep it under the carpet to ensure that everyone is happy and smiling going into Spa. But there's going to be a lot of questions, particularly on Thursday for the Belgian Grand Prix Media Day, Sam, to the likes of Max Verstappen in what talks have gone on behind the scenes. He's likely still going to have, you'd imagine, possibly a bit of tension about him going into this weekend.
Oh, for sure. But I mean, he should be pretty dialed in when it comes to Spa, given that he was racing there virtually over the weekend. So he's already got a fair number of practice laps in. So you never know. It could actually end up being to his advantage. But no, there will be questions. There always is. Even when you get 2, 3, 4 days between a Sunday media and then all the media sessions on Thursday, those questions that drivers maybe thought they had covered off or thought the news cycle had moved on, they get drawn back and you get new quotes and you get slightly new perspectives. I mean, a really good example is Lando in Silverstone, how different he was on that Thursday compared to how he was on Sunday in Austria. So those questions will be asked, and they should be asked. I think what Red Bull will expect of Max is for him to toe the company line.
Yeah.
When it comes to when they get to Belgium, and those conversations, they can happen over the summer. I mean, Red Bull are increasingly looking like they're going to have quite a busy summer at this rate. But I think it's a case of, right, we're going to a racetrack, as Ian rightly points out, that we're pretty good at, or we have a good history with. Let's just kind of knuckle down, get through this weekend. If we do take an engine penalty, minimise that damage, and then we can reassess. Then we can look at the final 10 races and how do we actually prevail in not only the Constructors' Championship, but potentially also the Drivers' Championship as well. That will be the key. So I think we'll see a much more conciliatory Max on Thursday.
Yeah, it will be really interesting. Actually, just a final point on Red Bull for this podcast. Ian, I want to talk about Sergio Perez because we addressed him obviously in Sunday's update, and obviously a very positive recovery drive following what was quite a nasty shunt in Q1 on Saturday. But the reason I want to talk about him is that whereas on Max, obviously last weekend was very aggressive over the radio, obviously GP had quite a difficult time, it seemed, trying to manage it. With Checo, we know he's under pressure. Obviously, it's now impossible for him to be within 100 points of Max Verstappen, so at least one of the clauses in his contract could theoretically be activated by Red Bull, which would see him potentially out the seat after the summer break. But with Checo, it seems actually something that perhaps goes massively in his favour is that, okay, whilst his performances on track may not be very consistent, it looks like as a driver, he's actually quite easy to manage compared to someone like Max Verstappen.
Yeah, you get that impression with Checo, and it's one of the reasons why Max has always enjoyed, over these past few years, having him as a teammate. Apart from that one incident, if you remember, with Monaco, where things happened there a couple of years back, and there was a bit of fiery consternation when we got to Sao Paulo and a few words were aired later in the season. Apart from that, they've relatively enjoyed a solid, fruitful relationship, predominantly because Max knows he has and likely always will have, for as long as Checo remains his teammate, the upper hand. It's very, very rare, as we've seen over these past few years, that Checo has ever come out on top and ever been the complete better driver than Max. So Max has always had this reliable wingman, rear gunner, whatever phrase you want to choose. On this occasion, though, this is now a little bit different for Red Bull. They are seeing their lead in the Constructors' Championship being eroded away by a McLaren team that is slowly becoming the dominant team right now. That was as good a weekend as we have seen from a team other than Red Bull for quite a period of time. Front row lockout, 1-2 in the race. So they're under pressure, Red Bull. Checo, regardless of what he achieved on Sunday, is still massively under pressure. Those clauses now will most certainly come into play.
Yeah.
Yes, he's not going to finish within 100 points of Max, as one of the clauses dictated in his contract going into this summer break. Just impossible now, whatever happens in Spa. And the other one was to be within 5 points of Max coming out of the summer break. That now looks like it's not going to happen either. I think he's dropped to 6 places behind
Yeah, Lewis
Max
is
in the
ahead.
standings. Lewis is now ahead. There's every possibility that George could also be ahead coming out of Spa. He is going to have the most complete weekend he has had for quite some time in a Red Bull. And I am talking about qualifying magnificently. We've got to look at a front row grid slot, certainly top 2 rows minimum, and then delivering, I would suggest, a podium performance to at least ease some of the concerns that might be going on, not only in the back of his mind. He says he's not worried. I asked him the question directly in the pen post-race on Sunday. Are you worried? No, he says. I doubt it very much. When you've got your bosses turning around and saying you are underperforming, you are under-delivering, we are going to look at things over the summer break after these 2 races, the latter comment being made by Helmut Marko, the first 2 by Christian Horner, you've got to be worried about your position. Yes, of course, you're going to know what's going on behind the scenes more than we are, but your bosses aren't saying that in public without there being some sort of reason. So, yeah, he's going to need a massive weekend in Belgium this weekend if he's to have any hope of coming out the other side of the summer break, still being in that RB20 in Zandvoort.
That definitely is something that we'll need to keep a very close eye on this weekend. In particular, obviously, if Red Bull do take an engine penalty for Max, they put more pressure on Perez to perform. Let's move on, though, to McLaren, because Max wasn't the only reason why the Hungarian Grand Prix was full of drama, and that's because one of his friends, Lando Norris, also gave us plenty of talking points. In the closing stages of the race, obviously started from pole position, but lost the lead into the first corner to Oscar Piastri, but was pitted first for the second round of pit stops by McLaren to cover Lewis Hamilton. This obviously gave Lando the undercut on Oscar. Oscar was then pitted afterwards to cover Max Verstappen, but was told by the team, have no fear, Oscar, we'll revert the positions, we'll give you the lead back. However, when Lando was asked several times to give the lead back, it seemed more and more the closer it got to the finish that he wasn't going to do so. And actually, one of the things he was said over the team radio by his race engineer on lap 66 of 70 was, Lando, to win a championship, you will need the team. You will need Oscar. Ian, that's very, very powerful. And we spoke about, obviously, in the F1 update on Sunday, McLaren's philosophy in that we are a team. You win as a team, you lose as a team. There is no I in team. It looked for several laps like Lando was going to be the kind of ruthless driver we've called for him to be, but perhaps in the most extreme way possible. And that a piece of radio I just read out kind of shows, in a way, just how concerned McLaren were getting, despite what they've obviously said after the race.
Yeah, that piece of radio, Nick, I think it got to the point where pretty much Will Joseph is race engineer, and you can only assume that instructions were coming down from Andrea Stella, the team principal, that, as I say, they'd run out of options, because throughout the previous exchanges, Will was making it quite clear to Lando, oh, you got excessive tyre wear in this corner, that corner, you just need to ease off the tyre wear. Basically, it was almost an instruction saying, please slow down, mate, allow Oscar to get up to the back of you, and then obviously ultimately allow him by. And he kept on doing that for a number of laps, and the number of corners that he kept calling out were increasing as well, where it appeared that Lando was not doing as he was told on the brakes and with regard to the tyres. And then, yes, it was almost like, this is the last resort now, mate. We are absolutely reminding you there is no I in team. You do as you are told on this occasion. Otherwise, you are going to feel the backlash from the team beyond this. Because without a shadow of a doubt, there would have been a backlash.
Yeah.
As we discussed in the F1 update on Sunday post-race, Nick, the most pertinent comment for me that came from Andrea Stella's post-race media huddle, and it was quite the media huddle as well. We were unable to do it in the team hub, sat down, gathered around a table around Andrea. Instead, we were doing it in one of the the McLaren facilities just outside on the paddock, where they were preparing tyres or wrapping, or at least on this occasion, they were sorting out the tyres post race. And he'd managed to put himself on a set of steps. We were all below looking up at him like that, so he got the higher ground on us. But just to confirm that this pertinent comment, as I was suggesting, was, this is the one of the principles of the team is that you have to be a team player. If you do not want to be a team player, then you will no longer be part of McLaren.
Yeah.
So that is a very, very powerful comment, basically reminding Lando, you don't want to play with us? That's fine, mate. Regardless of your talent, how good we think you are, then you will no longer be playing with us somewhere down the line. There would have been serious repercussions, serious ramifications if Lando had not ultimately decided to do what he did, and that was let Oscar by with 3 laps remaining. He said in the press conference, and do we believe him? It's up to you. And I'm looking at you guys, and I'm obviously considering our viewers and our readers and our listeners as well, whether you ultimately believe Lando when he turned around and said, bottom line, I would have let Oscar past. It was just a case of him almost toying with a team in a certain respect. And we talked about him wanting to be more ruthless. And I kind of got the impression there was a degree of ruthlessness in the way, as I say, he was toying with the team and seeing how they would play this situation out if he had always had it in his mind that he was going to let Oscar by.
And obviously on the flip side, it was Oscar who, obviously it was almost the big impacted driver, but spoke very well after the race, saying he still has full trust in Lando. He wasn't concerned that Lando would win the race instead of him, although he did concede that the situation was complicated. The big question is, though, and we've spoken about this on several podcasts in the last few weeks, is that McLaren seems to be getting its strategies a bit wrong recently, and it kind of caused its own headaches in the Hungarian Grand Prix by pitting Lando first. And obviously, as we saw, Lando actually had significantly better pace than Lewis in the closing stages. And obviously we saw what happened with Max as well. He just fell backwards after colliding with Lewis himself. Do you think McLaren's kind of shot itself in the foot a little bit, Sam, and created this situation itself?
Completely. I think it's fascinating that we are sat here having a conversation about a flawless weekend on track.
Yeah, 1-2.
In a negative light.
Yeah.
How that has been achieved is only by McLaren's making.
Applaudable.
And it's impressive. It is. I think first of all, Oscar is the consummate professional. Yeah. He handled himself with such grace, and you can't help but feel there was some disappointment there, that he felt that his first Grand Prix victory had been handed to him a little bit. And obviously I can't speak for him, and he is quite kind of, he's not particularly over the top in the way he kind of delivers things or how he celebrates, but he just didn't seem like the kind of figure who just won his first Grand Prix. It's a huge moment in any racing driver's career. And so that was a bit disappointing for him. But yeah, in terms of the overall situation, you kind of touched upon it already, Nick. There seems to be, every time McLaren is learning a lesson, and they're learning a lot of them at the moment, but every time they find themselves in a new situation, and again, yes, they are historically a giant in this sport, and they are still a big team. Lots of the people there haven't known the level of success or the dominance that they have had in eras gone by. So every time they're getting to these new scenarios that they're having to overcome, a mistake is being made at every single one. Sometimes it proves critical, like at Silverstone. Sometimes it doesn't, like at Budapest. But they need to start ironing those out, because they're going to get to points where they can't keep making mistakes in each of those moments, because it will potentially cost them championships. And I think what will be really key is how they respond from here. And really, what I took from how Lando Norris conducted himself, and first of all, I think he ended up in a kind of lose-lose situation where he should have either given up the position straight away, And he maybe could have then fought Oscar for the win. We don't know if that was agreed or not. Or he should have refused at all, because yes, we want this more ruthless Lando, but he ended up acquiescing to the team in the end. And again, that plays into this kind of, he was trying to push the boundaries, almost like a small child with their parent. Let's see how far I can take this. And he ultimately gave the power over to the team in that moment. And they know they can control him. And in order to win, there are going to be times where he has to kind of defy those team orders, a multi-21, if you like. So, yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how things kind of go from here. But, yeah, it's ultimately a steep learning curve for McLaren. But they need to start ironing out these mistakes because, yeah, the rest of the grid are going to be particularly unforgiving.
Well, if
bottom line is that they are learning. You got to remember, forget McLaren's history and what it has achieved, what it has won over the years. That counts for absolutely nothing right now. They were different times, different eras. This is a McLaren team that is really almost like learning on the job again how to be a front-running team, because they've not been in this position for quite a period of time. It's got a relatively young boss in charge in Andrea. It's got two young guys, at the wheel of their cars. It's got a team that's behind it that's still relatively new in terms of the way it's come together, in terms of what Andrea has put together behind the scenes of the team to support him. So quite naturally, they're going to make these mistakes, but ultimately they're going to learn. And for me, they're only going to get stronger for it because of Andrea Stella. He is, for me, right now, the foremost team principal on the grid. He is held in such esteem by everybody else around the paddock. And Zach Brown in particular was especially glowing, quite naturally, yes, it's his boss, of course, but was especially glowing of what Andrea Stella has done over the course of this past 18 months. Because at Silverstone, he had a media session there, Zach, and he was asked quite directly the question, why is this happening now? What has changed at McLaren? And for this to come to the fore now, why are you being so good? And he came out and basically said, well, I've got a one-word answer. Wasn't quite one word, it was actually two. And he just simply said, Andrea Stella. And then he expanded on that as to what Andrea had done over the period of time. But nevertheless, I believe in Andrea. This is a team that is absolutely going places. And just, I'm going to throw this at you guys. This is a little bit contentious, but nevertheless, it played into everything that happened. What was the one point in that Grand Prix that led to things having to change on the McLaren pit wall? Let's see if you can remember what the one point was.
I'm going to say, was it Oscar Piastri's mistake at turn 11?
Yeah.
Boom. There you go. He had about a 4.5 second lead at that particular point. He lost half of that, and then he lost a little bit more in the following laps as well. I think Lando managed to get under 2 seconds, and that all of a sudden changed the whole dynamic of what McLaren, I think, were going to do. Because with that 4.5 second gap to Lando and a bit further behind as well to whoever was chasing at that particular point, I think it was Lewis, then I'm pretty confident they would have pitted Oscar first because of that gap. But because that gap had dropped to under 2 seconds, they had to do a little bit of thinking on their feet for a second. Okay, we could argue that they played it ultra safe, and I think they did play it ultra safe. But nevertheless, that one small mistake from Oscar just changed the whole scenario for McLaren on their pit wall.
Absolutely. And again, an amazing point. Now, very, very quickly, a final talking point, because there were some punchy quotes and some really interesting quotes last weekend. We've just spoken about Andrea Stella. Let's now talk about another Andrea Kimi Antonelli, who obviously we kind of were expecting to be Lewis Hamilton's replacement at Mercedes. However, it seems like for a young driver, he's very mature and has kind of openly said himself, Sam and Ian, that he doesn't really feel ready.
Can I just say what a beautiful segue that was, Nick? I really appreciated that. That was
Andrea.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
One Andrea to Andrea in rapid fashion. Let's go for it.
I was really impressed actually by and how Kimi Antonelli conducts himself, I think it takes a lot of maturity for someone to kind of come out and say when they don't think they're ready for something. And I'm going to use a bit of an odd analogy, but people say that a president is never ready to be president, or like a parent is never ready to be a parent.
Here we go.
I think it's probably true of F1 drivers, right? I don't know if you're ever ready to take that step. I would be more concerned by an overly confident, almost cocky driver who's like, yep, I've got nothing to learn. I'm all good. I'm ready. Than I would be by how Kimi has come across. It shows that he is aware of what he needs to learn. And it can't get towards Lando Norris levels of being overly self-critical. He needs to have a short memory and learn from things. But I was impressed by his comments. I thought I was impressed generally over the weekend. Yes, the sprint race didn't quite go as it could have gone. That was partly due to Prema. You know, they together would have decided to go onto the soft tyre, which is a very odd thing to do in the F2 sprint race. Usually it's everyone on the hardest compound, no stops, you know, and that's that. But in the feature race, he was very, very impressive. The way he worked his through the field, the way he managed safety car restarts. And yeah, you know, he was what, fifth, I think, with a few laps to go when the last restart was made. And we're going to go, okay, right, he's got, you know, reel them off one by one, you know, over a number of laps. By the end of like 1 or 2 laps afterwards, he was up to second and challenging for the win. Or at that point already, he was very, very strong. And so, yeah, it was almost a bit of a coming of age moment for him. And Toto Wolff was very interesting in his comments and kind of saying, like, look, do you remember how stupid we all were at 17? You know, it's, you know, he is clearly impressed by his maturity. And I think, yeah, that says a lot. And I think it actually says that he's probably more ready than he himself maybe realizes.
Definitely.
Yeah, I sat in on that. I was going to say, Nick, I sat in on that F2 post-feature race press conference. And as soon as he came out with those comments, I was highly impressed by how eloquent he was, how honest and refreshingly honest he was, because you don't often hear that from you know, kids so young, and there's so much pressure as well when you consider the spotlight that he has been thrust under this season. You know, all this talk about him replacing Lewis at Mercedes, you know, pretty much from next season, never mind 2026. For him to say, yeah, I'm still making mistakes, I'm still learning processes, I'm still learning this and that. And I just thought, wow, I can see why Mercedes are now so impressed with you, not just with regard to what you can do on track and have done on track, given his junior career so far, but also with this level of maturity being displayed with regard to how you're feeling and what you think, you know, what you think you need to do to progress and move forward. Ultimately, we know he's going to get that Mercedes seat. So I think this is part of the what's going on now behind the scenes at Mercedes. If Kimi's coming out with these kind of comments saying, look, guys, I don't think I'm ready for 2025, that is now playing into this scenario as to why Toto Wolff is struggling to fill the seat for next season. If Kimi is turning around and saying, I'm sorry, boss, can you please give me another year? Because if you do, I just think I'm going to be so much better. I'll just leave you with this. When he was coming out with those comments yesterday, and bearing in mind what I've seen on track as well from all his racing so far, but listening to what he was saying, he came across to me as a very young Lewis Hamilton. So I think there's so much there, not just with regard to what he's doing on track, but with what he's coming out with up here as well, with regard to the way he's developing mentally as a driver. And I think he could be something really special in the years ahead, which is why I think Mercedes are now mulling over this second year in F2 for him, because they don't want to burn him out too soon, basically.
A young Lewis Hamilton, that's not a bad way to end. Very much a very mature young man on incredibly young shoulders, which is incredible. Sam, Ian, amazing as always. I'm not going to ask you for your biggest takeaway because I think all three of ours are probably the same in that despite McLaren and Red Bull both looking like they're in a title fight, both teams have issues they need to solve. This has been the latest episode of the RacingNews365.com podcast. Be sure to check out all our content for this weekend's Belgian Grand Prix. See you later.
Take care, folks.
Bye.